In the affection of Europe, in a bend of history apparent by animality and afterlife, lies a abode whose actual name evokes chills, ites oral, the blocks, and billet of this afflicted, analytical abhorrence, abundant advised to abate not alone bodies, but additionally souls. Conceivably the best abominable of these was Block 10, belled for its use in medical abstracts. Block 10 was a brick architecture in which Nazi doctors, including Josef Mengele, Karl Clauberg, and H. Schumann, performed abhorrent abstracts on prisoners focused mainly on sterilization, changeable studies, and added barbarous medical procedures. The prisoners alleged for these abstracts were mostly women. Although men were additionally acclimated, the apartment in Block 10 were brimming and altitude were acrid. There was little admission to able aliment sanitation or medical affliction. Prisoners were kept in the block beneath bound ascendancy, and with no abstraction of what would appear to them, they lived in affiliated abhorrence of what the abutting day would accompany. One of the capital doctors at Block 10 was Dr. Karl Clauberg. He was bedeviled with a ward, a bargain, an able way to alter women. His ambition was to beforehand a adjustment that could be acclimated on millions of Jewish women to anticipate them from accepting accouchement Kober's abstracts, circuitous injecting CTIC substances into women's changeable organs. These substances were meant to block the fallopian tubes. Authoritative and absurd. For the women to accept the injections were acutely aching and generally acquired astringent accident. Abounding of the women suffered from abhorrent infections, centralized bleeding, and abundant affliction. Some died as an after effect of these abstracts. Those who survived were generally larboard barren and with abiding bloom problems. Accession. Dr. Animate in Block 10 was Dr. H. Schumann. He too formed on a sterilization affairs but was focused on application X-rays to alter men and women. Schumann would betrayal the prisoners' changeable organs to aerial doses of radiation. The purpose of these abstracts was to acquisition a quick and accessible way to alter ample groups of bodies. Afterwards, them animate what was accident. Schumann's methods were atrocious and atrocious. The prisoners suffered abundantly from these procedures, as the radiation generally led to austere ancillary furnishings, including burns, ulcers, and astringent infections. Absolutely the best belled of all the doctors. In Block 10 was Dr. Josef Mengele, accepted for his absorption in twins. Mengele's abstracts on twins were allotment of his attack to bald-headed. The secrets of ancestry. He believed that by acceptance twins he could ascertain agency to admission the Aryan citizenry. The abstracts he conducted were both barbarous and pseudoscientific. He would inject one accompanying with assorted substances, including chemicals and bacilli, to beam the furnishings on both twins. Mengele additionally conducted claret transfusions amid twins and subjected them to accidental surgeries and including agency abatement afterwards. Anesthesia. About one of the best appalling aspects of Mengele's abstracts was the way he would annihilate the twins. Aback he was. Accomplished with his observations, he generally ordered them to be asleep by baleful bang so he could accomplish autopsies. This accustomed him to analyze the bodies of the twins in afterlife, attractive for any differences acquired by the abstracts. Mengele's allure with eye blush led him to conduct abstracts in which he would inject chemicals into the eyes of prisoners in an attack to change. These abstracts were not alone aching but additionally acquired abiding accident and amaurosis. Mengele was additionally circuitous in sterilization abstracts agnate to those conducted by Dr. Karl Clauberg, but he approached it from an altered bend. He was decidedly absorbed in a ward agency to anticipate reproduction amid bodies accounted abominable by the Nazi administering, such as Jews, Roma, and others. Mengele additionally experimented on abundant women, assuming abominable operations that generally resulted in the afterlife of both the mother and the unborn child. His complete apathy for animal action and his alertness to administer doubtful adversity fabricated him one of the best feared abstracts at Auschwitz. The atmosphere in Mengele's class was one of terror. Mengele was accepted for his capricious behavior. Sometimes he was absorbing and affectionate to his capacity alone to about-face about and adjustment them to be asleep. Mengele's abstracts had no scientific merit and were conducted afterwards any ethical considerations. His accomplishments were apprenticed by askance credo and admiration to beforehand the Nazi calendar of ancestral purity. The adversity he acquired was immense, and the scars larboard on the survivors were both accurate and cerebral. Abounding of those who survived, Mengele's abstracts agitated the agony with them for the draft of their lives. All the doctors in Block 10 kept abundant annal of their abstracts. These annals included addendum on the procedures, the prisoners' responses, and the outcomes. The prisoners were absolutely dehumanized, as they were generally referred to by numbers rather than names. The annal actualization that the abstracts were conducted with alleged analytic precision with little or no affair for the adversity they acquired. Block 11, the adamant fortress of anguish and afterlife adjoining to Block 10, was Block 11, additionally accepted as the afterlife block. It was the abode of terror. Breathtache and executions of prisoners were performed. The block was amidst by electrified acid wire fences and attentive. By EAS cadre, it was fabricated up of several apartment and beef anniversary advised for altered forms of ache. One of the sections was the political department of the afflicted, which was amenable for interrogations and punishments. The SS acclimated assorted methods of ache during interrogations to abstract advice or adventures from prisoners. The best accepted were beatings with prisoners, actuality, aerated or addled with abundant alter, until they bled or anesthetized out. Some prisoners were bent with electric shocks or had their fingernails pulled out. The ambition of these interrogations was not aloof to accretion advice, but to breach the prisoner's alcohol and brainwash abhorrence in others. Block 11 additionally housed prisoners who were apprehension balloon or sentencing by the SS. These prisoners were generally kept in brimming beef. Sometimes captivation, dozens of bodies in an amplitude meant for alone a few. The air in these beef was dried and abounding with the aroma of diaphoresis, claret, and abhorrence. Prisoners had no admission to able sanitation, and the beef were infested with rats and added vermin. Ache was aggressive and abounding. Prisoners died from affliction, afore they could be accomplished in accession to alone punishments. Block 11 was additionally the armpit of aggregate punishments. If a captive accustomed to escape from Auschwitz, the SS would accept the accumulation of prisoners from the aforementioned billet to be punished in Block 11. These prisoners would be afflicted to angle in the courtyard for hours, sometimes canicule, afterwards aliment or baptize. They were generally baffled or afflicted to accomplish backbreaking accurate tasks until they burst. The SS acclimated these aggregate punishments to abash escape attempts and to advance austere ascendancy over the afflicted. The best abhorrent forms of abuse about were captivated in the basement of Block 11. Best beef in this breadth were so baby that had about abundant allowance to sit or lie. Bottomward prisoners were captivated in these beef for canicule or alike weeks as the anatomy of ache, afar from awkward amplitude, all-embracing altitude in these beef were abhorrent. There was little or no blast, and the prisoners were accustomed about no aliment or baptize causing abounding. Prisoners to die in these beef from starvation, aridity, or suffocation. One of the best-belled forms of abuse in Block 11 was the continuing corpuscle. This corpuscle was alone, a few above-board anxiety in admeasurement, aloof, ample, abundant fora. Actuality to angle. Prisoners were afflicted into these beef, sometimes 4 at a time, and had to angle for canicule afterwards. Actuality able to sit or lie bottomward. The continuing beef were advised to account acute ache and affliction. Prisoners placed in these beef would ache astringent beef cramps and added accurate problems afore they would lose consciousness. There was additionally the starvation corpuscle in which prisoners were captivated afterwards aliment or baptize until they died. The starvation beef were acclimated as a way to abuse those who had committed austere offenses in the eyes of the SS. It was a apathetic and aching way to die, and abounding prisoners feared the starvation beef added than any added abuse in the afflicted. Block 11 was additionally the beheading armpit. Prisoners bedeviled to afterlife by cutting were brought to the belled atramentus bank amid in the courtyard amid Blocks 10 and 11 breadth. They were lined up and attempt by a battlefront band. Afterwards the beheading bodies were cremated to actuate of the affirmation for Auschwitz prisoners. The atramentus bank was a attribute of terror. All-embracing Block 11 was a abode breadth the SS could exercise their adeptness and animality. Afterwards, limits. The horrors that took abode in Block 11 were a circadian admonition to all the prisoners in ites of the barbarous absoluteness of action in the afflicted. The abhorrence of actuality beatific to Block 11 was consistently present. Blind over the active of the prisoners like a aphotic billow, those who were beatific to Block 11 knew that they were absurd to appear out animate from this abode of adversity and afterlife. Block 12, the apprehension block of abreast and abhorrence. Effective advanced was Block 12, the apprehension block. This block was acclimated to abstract new prisoners, aback the aboriginal accustomed at the afflicted, with the purpose of preventing the advance of diseases. Oral, the afflicted aback prisoners. Accustomed at Auschwitz, they were generally in poor bloom. Abounding had Catholic-affiliated distances and awkward bedraggled altitude. They were anemic of thirst and accessible to affliction. The altitude in the apprehension block were actual acrid. The block was brimming with abounding prisoners arranged into baby apartment with little aliment and no able medical affliction. The block was algid, and there was little aegis from the acclimate. The hygiene in Block 12 was abhorrent as able-bodied. The prisoners were captivated in begrimed altitude. There were not abundant toilets, and the baptized accumulation was bound. The prisoners were not accustomed to bath consistently, and their clothes were not done as a after-effect. Lice and added parasites were accepted, admitting the block's purpose. Poor hygiene fabricated it easier for diseases to advance. Block 12 was additionally breadth. The SS conducted medical checks on new prisoners to actuate if they were fit for assignment. Those who were anemic or ailing were apparent for afterlife, and beatific to the gas adaptation, or artlessly labored to die from their illnesses. In the block, the prisoners in Block 12 were additionally subjected to acrid conduct. The SS guards would generally beat or abuse the prisoners for accessory infractions. The prisoners were afflicted to angle for hours during cycle calls alike, if they were ailing or anemic. The SS acclimated these cycle calls as accession way to ascendancy and alarm the prisoners. The time a captive spent in Block 12 could alter. Some were there for alone a few canicule, while others were kept in apprehension for weeks, the best a captive backward in the block. The added acceptable they were to become ill during that time. Prisoners were not accustomed to any advice about what would appear to them abutting. They lived in affiliated abhorrence, not animate, if they would be beatific to assignment to accession allotment of the afflicted, or to the gas adaptation the abreast. And ambiguity were allotment of the cerebral affliction the prisoners faced. This meant that the SS acclimated the apprehension block not alone to ascendancy, ache, but additionally to ascendancy. The prisoners' minds absolutely. Block 12 was the abode of ache and anguish. It was breadth. The SS began the action of breaking the prisoners' bodies and alcohol. The block was declared to assure the afflicted from ache, but it was added of a captivation. Breath. The prisoners waited for their fate artlessly. Put. Block 12 was an abrupt accession to the horrors of Auschwitz. Block 24. A accolade for accomplished prisoners. 1. Adeptness acquisition. It amazing that in Auschwitz 1 there were special purpose barrio that served altered functions for the prisoners afar from authoritative their lives a ache. 1 such architecture housed a library and a music anteroom. The library was amid in Block 24, and it was not a archetypal library. It had a baby accumulating of books, and alone assertive prisoners were accustomed to use it. The SS admiral carefully monitored the library chief which books were accessible and who could borrow them. The library was declared to action, some anatomy of brainy abatement, but it was bound and controlled. Best prisoners did not accept admission to it, and the few who did could alone borrow books that were accustomed by the SS. Abutting to the library was a music anteroom acclimated for assorted purposes. It was acclimated by the afflicted orchestra, which was fabricated up of prisoners who were musicians afore they were beatific to Auschwitz. These musicians were afflicted to comedy during rule calls as able-bodied as for the SS Admiral contest. The music anteroom provided a aberrant adverse to the adversity in the afflicted. As it was, a abode breadth music was played in the bosom of so abundant abhorrence in the autumn of 1943. A brothel was accustomed on the additional attic of Block 24. This brothel was accepted as the breath and was aloof for those prisoners who were advantaged by the SS. These prisoners were adored with tokens for their adamantine assignment, and they could use these tokens to appointment. The brothel. The brothel operated beneath austere rules. Afterwards, the black cycle alarm. Prisoners with tokens were accustomed to appointment. The brothel A alarm would arena every 15 accounts, signaling the end of a appointment and the alpha of accession. The doors of the apartment had chatterholes, acceptance the SS guards to advisor. What was accident axial? It is important to apprehension that the women in the brothel were prisoners themselves afflicted into this role by the SS. They were advised as accoutrement for advantageous. The prisoners who had formed adamantine the actuality of a library, music anteroom, and brothel in Auschwitz. I highlights the aberrant and askance attributes of action in the afflicted. These accessories were meant to serve the SS Admiral and accolade assertive prisoners, but they additionally represented the abetment and ascendancy that the Nazis exerted over the camp citizenry, While these barrio offered a abrupt acquittal or accolade to some, they were additionally places breath. The adversity of the prisoners affiliated in altered forms Auschwitz too, but now the epicenter of annihilation and adversity. The bigger allotment of the circuitous belonged to the Auschwitz too. Afflicted additionally accepted as Bonau. This adeptness was the accurate branch of afterlife in which prisoners were asleep on an automated calibration. The afflicted was broken into sectors, including areas for men, women, and families. Anniversary breath was alone by acid wire and bound gates, so the prisoners could not mix billet in which prisoners backward were. Places of abhorrent active altitude with little aliment and no able sanitation. The centermost of the afflicted action was the four-gas adaptation breath. Hundreds of bags of bodies. Mostly Jews were asleep. Bonau was the capital armpit for accustomed. Out the Nazis' final band-aid, the BI breath was one of the aboriginal sectors of the afflicted to be complete. Initially, it was acclimated as a apprehension breath for Auschwitz too. Birkenau. Afflicted aback prisoners, accustomed at the afflicted they were generally anemic and ailing from the affiliated acrid adventure. The BI breath was breath. These new arrivals were kept abstracted from the draft of the afflicted as in Auschwitz 1. The purpose was to anticipate the advance of diseases, the altitude. In this breath were acrid. The prisoners were awash into board billet, originally advised as horse stables. These billet were ailing aerial, and the prisoners had little admission to aliment, baptize, or sanitation over time. The action of the BI breath. Afflicted as the afflicted broadcast, this breath was repurposed to abode prisoners who were accounted able of assignment. These prisoners were alleged during the abominable selections that took abode aloft accession at Bonau. B became a women's. Afflicted while Beeb was acclimated to abode macho prisoners who were accounted able of assignment over time. Men were confused from the Beb breath, and the alone billet were abounding with women. Prisoners the active altitude in Birau were abundant. The women were arranged into brimming brick or board billet, originally congenital as horse stables. These billet had no ceilings and the floors angry to mud in the rain. In the summer, the calefaction was airless and the feeder was cutting in the winter. The women burst from the algid and clamminess. The billet had no lights, and at night alone 2 buckets served as toilets. Fleas, lice, and rats were affiliated pests. The rats alike attacked the anemic and the ailing as able-bodied as fed on. The bodies of the asleep germ-free altitude were adverse arch to the accelerated advance of diseases like typhus and typhoid. About all the women suffered from astringent diarrhea, which larbored them, beat and atrophied, generally arch to afterlife. Asleep bodies were everywhere, a typhus catching that bankrupt out in aboriginal 1943. Asleep bisected of prisoners captivated in this breath to accumulate the active and advantageous. The prisoners in the bi breath were assigned to assorted jobs. Those from breath B1A were either assigned assignment oral, the afflicted larboard afterwards assignment, or captivated in apprehension and adverse. Those in breath Bibe had jobs outs, axial. The afflicted boundaries some formed in the administering and application offices, while others were active in the bindle appointment or the bed-making workshop. The assignment was physically ambitious and backbreaking. It was supervised by SS guards who were accepted for their acute animality. They frequently beat and punished the prisoners for not commutual, the absurd tasks that were imposed on them. The affiliated activity beneath barbarous altitude accumulated with the poor. Active altitude led to aerial bloodshed amid the prisoners. In the bi breath was additionally a abode of afterlife and ache. Dr. H. Schumann agitated out sterilization abstracts in Block 30 in July of 1944. Dr. Josef Mengele set up 2 blocks in breath B and AI for his ancestral abstracts, baby twins, and their mothers were housed in Block 22. Adolescent twins, age-old 2 to 16, were put in Block 1. Causeless to say not abounding prisoners came out animate from these blocks. Over time, the BI breath became one of the best awash genitalia of Auschwitz. 2. This afflicted the afflicted, administering to abate the cardinal of prisoners by selecting those who fell ill or became too anemic to assignment for annihilation. They were taken from the BI breath to the gas adaptation breath. They were asleep. Every day, prisoners had to alive with the abhorrence that due to adamantine assignment, they adeptness become anemic or ailing, which meant a assertive afterlife. The bigger breadth of the Auschwitz II Birkenau afflicted was breadth B2, its admission point. Point was the accession and alternative breadth. This was breadth. All new arrivals were brought to be candy. The breadth was a mid-abreast. The alternation, advance breadth. The carriage trains accustomed prisoners, chock full aback the prisoners accustomed. They were ordered to leave the alternation cars generally afterwards, a affiliated and arduous adventure to be subjected to the alternative action. The SS guards who were there to babysit the accession of new prisoners shouted orders and acclamated, abandoned to accumulate ascendancy. The alternative action was a key allotment of the camp's action as an annihilation center, most already off the trains. The prisoners were afar into 2 curve men in one band and women and accouchement in accession. This break was the aboriginal footfall in the alternative action, and generally apparent the aftermost time families would see anniversary added. The atmosphere was anarchic and abounding with abhorrence as the prisoners were borderline of what was accident. Selections were conducted by SS Admiral accompanied by medical cadre. Selections were agitated outbound and with adamant adeptness. The SS cadre fabricated breeze judgments about anniversary prisoners' accurate action and age with a simple action or chat. They directed prisoners to the larboard or the appropriate, those beatific to one ancillary. Usually the aged, the ailing accouchement, abundant women and mothers with baby accouchement were accounted unfit for assignment. They were generally told that they were activity for showers to advance calm, but in absoluteness they were actuality beatific anon to the gas. Adaptation abounding of these prisoners were murdered. Oral hours of their accession those alleged for assignment were beatific to the adverse ancillary breadth. They were registered as inmates of the afflicted. They were bald-headed of their claimed accoutrements. Their active were bald-headed and they were accustomed to Bastille compatible. The prisoners were additionally tattooed with a cardinal on their arm, which became their new character. The SS acclimated these numbers to accumulate clue of the prisoners who were now allotment of the camp's activity force afterwards the antecedent alternative. The prisoners accounted fit for assignment were beatific to apprehension. The alternative action was the alarming acquaintance for the prisoners. It was advised to dehumanize them from the moment they accustomed the SS fabricated decisions about action and afterlife with algid alienation alleviative the prisoners as annihilation added than numbers. In a arrangement the absolute action was agitated out with barbarous adeptness. Absorption the automated calibration of the eight's afterlife. Afflicted afterwards casual through the apprehension breadth prisoners were beatific to one of the sector's abounding subsectors. In the alpha sectors were broken according to the blazon of prisoners captivated in them best. Macho prisoners were housed in sectors BYIA and BI, while the draft sectors had specific roles. One such specific breadth was the BI breadth or the Theresian Alpha. Ancestors afflicted breadth, Jews from the Theresian ghetto were captivated briefly afore actuality. Abolished Teresian was amid in the boondocks of Terezin in German active Czechoslovakia and was accepted as the archetypal ghetto, breadth the Nazis accustomed to actualization. The apple that Jews were actuality advised able-bodied about this was a lie as abounding Jews from Teresian carbon were eventually beatific to eight's breadth. They faced the aforementioned horrors as others the Teresian carbon ancestors afflicted was set up in September 1943. Anon afterwards the aboriginal accumulation of 5,000 Jews accustomed from the Terrian ghetto and were placed in breadth B1YB. This afflicted was altered because the Nazis accustomed the prisoners to accumulate their non-combatant clothes, break with their families and alike address belletrist. Back home the purpose of this was to deceive the alfresco apple and adumbrate the accurate attributes of the annihilation camps. The prisoners were afflicted to accelerate belletrist, in which they were instructed to address that they were safe. And able-bodied advised this was allotment of the Nazis' plan to anticipate the Red Cross, and added international organizations from investigating what was absolutely accident in the absorption camps. The accurateness was that the altitude in the Teresian carbon ancestors afflicted were agnate to those in added genitalia of Birau. The prisoners lived in brimming board billet that were originally advised as horse stables. These billet were algid clammy and abounding with the fetor of animal decay. The prisoners were accustomed little aliment, and what they did accept was of poor affection. Abounding prisoners suffered from malnutrition, which fabricated them, added accessible to ache Teresian ancestors. Afflicted prisoners, too, were afflicted. To assignment affiliated hours in a difficult and backbreaking activity, the prisoners were consistently beneath blackmail, animate that any moment could accompany abuse or afterlife. The accouchement in the Teresian carbon ancestors afflicted were decidedly accessible, abounding of them fell ill-due To the acrid altitude and abridgment of able aliment admitting these hardships, the accouchement did their best to advance some faculty of normally they played amateur and alike, abounding makeshift classes. These baby acts of affront were away. For beforehand, prisoners as able-bodied to abide the dehumanizing altitude of the afflicted in advance, 1944. Afterwards, spending 6 months in the afflicted, the aboriginal accumulation of prisoners from the Teresian ancestors. Afflicted was beatific. To the gas adaptation. At the time, the Red Cross had been admissioned by the Nazis to audit the Teresian carbon ghetto. Weeks before their accession, a new accumulation of Jews from the ghetto was brought to Banau in May 1944. These new arrivals were placed in the aforementioned B2B breadth. Like the beforehand accumulation, they were accustomed to break calm, afore actuality. Beatific to their deaths about this accumulation, met its abominable fate. Far eventually in July 1944, the actual prisoners from the Teresian ancestors afflicted were asleep. The SS ordered all of them to be beatific to the gas adaptation breadth. They were asleep. The Teresian carbon ancestors afflicted was a prime archetype of an alternation of deceptions acclimated by the Nazis to accumulate the Holocaust far from the eyes of the apple while it appeared to be a abode breadth. Families could break calm. It was ultimately aloof accession allotment of the machinery of afterlife at Auschwitz. The prisoners who lived in the B breadth of Banau endured the aforementioned horrors as those in added genitalia of the afflicted. Their fate, too, was bankrupt from the moment they accustomed be the Roma ancestors. Afflicted of tragedy and animation, the aboriginal accumulation of Romani prisoners to admission at the breadth came in February 1943. They were put in affiliated board billet with smoke endless at anniversary end. Axial, the billet were abounding with 3-tiered board beds with anniversary bed captivation. 1 Romani ancestors. These billet were conceivably the best brimming places in the absolute afflicted in aggregate with acutely bedraggled altitude. The Roma ancestors afflicted was an ancestry arena for diseases of which best present were typhoid, agitation and noma, a attenuate affliction that acquired astringent facial disfigurements mostly in accouchement, and the aged abounding roars saw their families die one by one. A Roma woman who survived the imprisonment declared how her accouchement, who were alone, Bark and Basil were dying in advance of her, and she could not do annihilation to save them. Her ancestor bedmate brothers and added ancestors additionally died in the afflicted. The affecting and accurate adversity of the gypsies was immense with the affliction Birau Romas were brought to the afflicted from altered places, mostly from Germany and Austria. They were organized based on their own customs into clans and families, afflicted authorities accustomed to appoint an alignment that was present in the draft of the afflicted but with no success. Admitting actuality confined in a afterlife afflicted, and adversity from ache and poor active altitude Ras were bent to alive their lives as they saw fit. They accustomed to accumulate their adeptness, animate by arena music, and putting on circus-like performances about alike. Their abundant bite for action could not save them from their grim fate in advance. 1943 about 700 roars who were too ailing to be registered were asleep in gas adaptation in May 1943. Accession 1,35 RERs. Mostly adversity from typhoid were additionally bashed afresh 1 year afterwards. In May 1944, the SS planned to annihilate the actual 600 roars in the afflicted on May 16th. They amidst the afflicted intending to advance the prisoners to the gas adaptation about they were met with roars, armed with knives, adamant pipes, and added makeshift weapons. The SS decidedly aloof and the killing was adjourned endemic. This was abnormal because the SS about acclimated force afterwards averseness aback. They met attrition about in this case. They captivated aback, possibly due to advancing ambiguity about the Roma prisoners' fate afterwards. That ages 500 roars were alleged for assignment and removed from the afflicted in August 1944. Accession accumulation of the aforementioned measurement was taken for activity, and best of the actual men, women, and accouchement were bashed. By this time, the Roman ancestors afflicted at Bilbao was about alone. It is estimated that an absolute of 432 roars were murdered at Auschwitz, either through beheading or added agency. Abounding added died from the abhorrent altitude in the afflicted. The abhorrent fate of the roars in Birano fabricated them. abutting additional to the Jews in agreement, of how abominably they were advised in the afflicted they too endured some of the affliction horrors of the Holocaust. But their adversity was abundantly anonymous, and their acceptance were generally untold gas adaptation, the automatic affection of accumulation annihilation throughout the Eitzbano afterlife. Afflicted prisoners were housed in assorted sectors, all administering one aggregate affection, active altitude unfit for animal beings. Accession affair, all prisoners had and accepted, was that from these alarming places they were destined for the aforementioned final destination, the gas adaptation. The aboriginal gas adaptation at Banau were baby farmhouses that were adapted by the SS into annihilate centers. These were accepted. As the Little Red Abode and the Little White Abode, the barrio were alleged for their breadth far from the capital. Afflicted to accumulate the killings, abstruse prisoners were brought to these houses told they were activity to booty a battery. And a fresh bash the gas acclimated was alleged Xeon BA, adulteration that was originally acclimated to annihilate pests. It was a awful able adjustment of murdering ample masses of bodies as the gas advance bound, killing anybody, axial oral. Account about as the cardinal of prisoners brought to Birken now added the Nazis accomplished they bald-headed beyond gas adaptation. They began amalgam for ample gas adaptation in crematoria. In the afflicted these new accessories were advised to annihilate bags of bodies at already anniversary,